Hello everyone, and welcome to the Haiku, a lesson in Japanese poetry by Monica Bourne. So a brief history about the haiku. During the Heian period of Japanese culture, it was a societal requirement to be able to instantly recognize, appreciate, and recite Japanese and Chinese poetry. The rigid lifestyles of the time carried over into art. Every poem had to have a specific form. The approved form was the 5-7-5 triplet, followed by a couplet of 7 syllables. This was the Japanese equivalent to the iambic pentameter of Shakespeare. Two types of poetry were the renga, which is linked verse, and the kusari no renga, chains of linked verse. These forms were used almost as parlor games for the high class. So, the most popular form of Japanese poetry is called the waka. Now, the waka is just the basic term for Japanese poetry, but it can also be interchanged with the word tanka, just because the tanka was a short form of the waka, and the choka was a long waka. So, the choka was obviously longer, so as the poetry gained popularity, the shorter form was much more popular. And so we use the words waka and tanka are sometimes used interchangeably. So, what is a waka then? It is a short poem with a specific structural requirements, written to express feelings. There is yet another general difference. Over the century, waka were written to capture emotions, then more to capture emotions than to explain or define them. So here are some examples of tankas that I have written. Trees. I am known to some as one of the eldest here. No one is as tall. Shades and bough cover the ground. Leaves and limbs scrape the high skies. And falling in love. The shimmer of light. Skies of blue, reflected eyes. A tenderest love. Sharing heart and beauty spoke. With surprise, the dawn awoke. So these are just some basic examples. Now, in the tanka, the formula is 5-7, or 5-7-5, and then 7-7. So it's sort of a long haiku. Now, these short poems have been important to the Japanese throughout their history. These have been used to celebrate special occasions since ancient times. In the Heian period especially, waka were a most important form of communication between lovers, and a person's skill in poetry was a major criterion in determining his or her standing in society, even influencing political positions. Now, the history of the haiku. The haikai is a relaxed form of renga. Now, renga is made up of linked stanzas of tankas, joined in sequence so that each made an integral poetic unit with its predecessor, but without semantic connection with any other stanza in the sequence made of such alterations. It probably won't surprise you to learn that there were crazy complex rules as to what kinds of stanzas went in what order, and a single renga might be written by as many as 3 poets. So the haikai was a relaxed form of this renga, so it had more lighthearted themes as well. So the renga, or the reku, is the modern name for the haikai. The hoku is the opening stanza of a renga or haikai, with 3 lines of 5-7-5 syllables. If you're familiar with the haiku, that structure will sound mighty familiar. In fact, the haiku developed out of the hoku, but the concept of haiku as a freestanding form wasn't developed until late 1800s, and the haiku was a form of peasant poetry. So one of the most famous poets who wrote haikus was Matsuo Basho. Now, this poet, he infused a new sensibility and sensitivity to this form in the late 17th century. He transformed the poetics and turned the hoku into an independent poem, later to be known as a haiku. Now, this poem that I have quoted here isn't exactly the 5-7-5 order, mostly just because it's in English instead of Japanese. How wild the sea is, and over Sado Island, the river of heaven. So you can see that kind of emotional, just catching a glimmer of something, an idea and a feeling, rather than explaining something or being super strict with rhyming. So on the other, this picture depicts how the Japanese characters are romanized and then how those translate. So you can see that the syllables would correspond to the form when they are in Japanese, such as the last line, which is the sound of water, which is the sound of water, which also works in English, but in Japanese that would be mizu no oto, which is also 5 syllables. Now, when you write haiku, it should accomplish a few things. According to the classic haiku poets of Japan, haiku should present the reader with an observation of a natural, commonplace event, in the simplest words, without verbal trickery. The effect of haiku is one of sparseness. So, and then we already talked about the basic structure of the haiku is 3 lines of 17 syllables, 5, 7, 5. So here are a couple of examples of haikus in Japanese. On the left, you see the romanization of it, and on the right, you have some of the Japanese characters and their romanization and their translation. So on the left, it could be pronounced as Hito mo minu, haru ya kagame no ura no ume. And you can see how that translates. The spring they don't see, plum blossom, on the back of a mirror. So here are some examples that I found of English haikus, which I'm assuming were written by students. Winter by the pond, ice hangs from a craggy tree. Where did the frogs go? And the other one, I saw 2 seagulls and a red bird in a tree, waiting there for spring. Now it's your turn. You can choose any variety of topics, from forgotten friends, the summer's day, blue, the sea, which are topics that I picked here. Now, in these forms of poetry, the haiku is probably the most demanding of the reader. It demands the reader's participation because haiku merely suggests something in the hopes that the reader will find a glimpse of hitherto unrecognized depths in the self. Without a sensitive audience, haiku is nothing. And that's a quote that I found. So, these haiku are supposed to be much more lighthearted and give a feeling of zen. It was their purpose. So, what are you going to write your haiku about? Have fun!